Good afternoon, everybody. I didn't realise that our confidence and supply agreement with Fine Gael extended to electoral reform. I'm delighted that Joe has now increased by 100% the people that are advocating a new system of electoral system and reform. I was disappointed to hear last night that it's not on anybody's agenda over the next 3 or 4 years, and I think it is a fairly fundamental step that we need to take. Regina Doherty said that she uses a script. Ona Bryn just used notes. Regina uses a script because she now feels she has to keep to the script. I was never very good at keeping to scripts. I use it now because I'm at that age that I could forget what I wanted to say. So. What I'm going to just talk about this afternoon again is new politics, why we need it, what is it in my view, what does it need to do for us as a country, and what are the threats to that new politics. And I suppose the central core of what I'm going to say is that new politics is now the only option, I believe, open to parties and politicians of the centre if they want to restore trust and faith and belief in politics. I think the Irish electorate are now very intensely intolerant of the status quo. They believe that we can do better, and they demand that of all of the political parties. And if centrist parties like Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour and the Social Democrats, even though they may object to that tag, if they fail to do better, those on the fringes, left and right, more particularly left at the moment, will capitalise further on the disaffection that's felt by many because of what we've been through. And I believe if we don't do that, or if those parties don't do that, it'll mean the end of at least one of them within a decade. Centrist politicians have to buy into a system of real and genuine collaboration. Not just for now, was raised earlier on this morning, but right into the future, irrespective of the makeup of the Dáil Éireann. It's the only way that the politicians can reclaim the centre for the benefits of Irish society. Just for today's discussion, let me describe rather than define what I believe new politics is and why it's essential for our democracy. It strikes me a little bit that our definition of it, or our belief as to what it is very much like the definition that used to be given to Fianna Fáil when anybody was trying to describe whether they were left or right. They just ended up saying, they're all things to all men. And I suppose new politics, to an extent, is the way it's been flung around at the moment, somewhat like that. There's certainly plenty of evidence to show that there are a lot of people using every current example of silly political behaviour and ascribing it to new politics in order to dismiss the new politics that we're talking about. So I think for that reason it's important to describe it, and otherwise it'll simply be dressed up or dismissed, as it has been over the last number of months, as a dressed up version of old politics. If that's how it's perceived, or if that's how it's practiced into the future, I think people will be further alienated from politics and the political system and politicians, and I believe as a democracy we cannot afford that. So to me, new politics is a fundamental shift in how our political system and our politicians work. It's a complete reversal of the position where Parliament ended up being a mere rubber stamp for the executive. It's a transformation from autocratic governance to an open, consultative and participative democracy. From a system where the winner took all and dictated policy for the lifetime of that particular government, usually, as Frank has indicated, for 3 or 4 years at a time. And it's a change from that to one where all public representatives, all of the people elected by the people, have a say and an input into policy and legislation. A system, I might add, again, referring to what Frank has said, that has worked very well in our local government system for quite a considerable period of time. New politics, as far as I'm concerned, is a politics where ideas and idealism replace party shibboleths, where policy replaces personality, where the real needs of people are put before party interests and vested interest. In new politics, the politicians see politics as a means to an end, that end being the serving of the people, rather than an end in itself, which is the politicians serving themselves. And that new politics, properly executed, is a way to rebuild that trust in our democratic systems. And whether many of them know it or not, our politicians have little choice but to embrace this particular change. The results of the last election made it very, very clear. Trust in our and faith in our political system and our politicians was at a low ebb. The economic crash completely undermined faith in our system of government and in our political system. It removed a lot of old certainties. It left people unsure. It left them frightened. Our fears were replaced by our dreams. Or rather, the other way around, our dreams were replaced by our fears, as somebody has said. It fundamentally changed our society and our politics. And older people who came through previous depressions, recessions, and lived most of their life through poverty, adjusted and coped much better. But for many of those born in the late 70s, the 80s, and later, it was a new and terrifying experience. It left them bewildered, angry, with no hope, and ready to lash out. And that should be no surprise to the political system. The political system was supposed to protect them from such a catastrophe, and it failed them. Politicians seem to be too caught up in party politics, too tied up in the system to be able to act effectively and deal with the new realities and the real issues that affected the lives of people. And it became apparent that the problems of a post-recession, globalising world were beyond our political system and our politicians. So the system has to adapt and adjust to those new realities. Dressing up old politics and calling it new politics just won't work, because the electorate are far too savvy to buy that. They have seen the major recession. They've seen the political system unable to cope with it. They know it has to change, and they want that change. And that's what they've been saying both in the 2011 and the 2016 general election. Many people have actually, one of the positives of the fallout from the economic crash was that many people have re-engaged or engaged for the first time with politics and the political system. The status quo doesn't satisfy those people, and if the established parties don't recognise that, those people that are freshly engaged will look at the alternatives that promise a better, safer future. It's a risky, uncertain alternative, but even uncertainty for these people is better than an uncaring status quo that sees them squeezed within an inch of their lives. These people will have to see evidence that in the new politics, the politicians are prepared to adopt the old maxim of business, which was think globally, act locally. So new politics means that our national politicians can no longer be mired in the local. For as long as they are, we'll be reactive and susceptible to global events. We'll dutifully wait for the next global problem, the next global crisis, to wash up on our shore, rather than to put in place mechanisms locally to deal with them. The financial crisis is one example of that, a horrific example of it. Irish water is another, and there are more pressing ones coming, such as the ageing population, global terrorism, disruptive technologies constantly rendering millions of jobs obsolete. The response for moderate centrist politicians is not to veer left or right, but to hold the centre. The centre has to hold against those that Yeats described as the worst, who have passionate intensity. Irish people, as we saw in the last election, are inherently fair and moderate. They'll move back to the centre when they see it working for them, and for not just for themselves, but for those less fortunate than themselves. As I said, the last election, I think, proved that. To get the trust back, we need to ensure our system delivers the services required in a civilised society. Good healthcare, proper housing, an education system that delivers for all, and a care system that ensures that no one gets left behind. So the political system must deliver prosperity, but it also must share that prosperity. Increased prosperity has meant that the electorate aren't content to watch extreme poverty and extreme riches on television. Economic equity and the opportunity are becoming more important to the voting public, and the Irish public, as Stephen outlined earlier on, are very fair and want to see a sharing. People no longer accept a world where corporations can make astronomical amounts of money while countries they operate in hardly receive any taxation at all, in the teeth of austerity-driven measures. A start has been made in all of this. The Dáil reforms are making the House more inclusive and consultative. Government can no longer drive legislation through and use guillotines. Opportunities exist now for opposition parties to put forward positive, constructive proposals. A wider spectrum of voices is heard now. In a sense, we're returning to an era where politics was defined as the art of compromise. Latterly, compromise was always portrayed as a sign of weakness. U-turn was the usual media headline when somebody listened in politics or in power and decided to change a policy. I think compromise in politics should be seen as a sign of strength. The alternative to all of what I'm saying in new politics is the risk for the mainstream parties of alienating the electorate further from their naturally centrist political view and moving them to the extremes. The result of that in the medium to longer term will be disastrous. More and more people will look to the false prophets who claim they can deliver an alternative without ever having to explain what that alternative is, what will happen the day after they bring down the current system. If you don't think it's a serious matter, just look across at our neighbours. Politicians selling a picture of complete negativity to win a referendum with no vision beyond the immediate aim of bringing down the system. Almost 100 years ago to the day that happened, British generals sent thousands of young men to their deaths in the Somme. The modern British elite gambled with their country in an effort to seize political power, and having succeeded, they just walked off the pitch. Don't get me wrong, I don't think new politics is the solution to everything. It will not prevent politicians from being politicians. It won't prevent parties from seeking to gain political advantage. But it will mean that rhetoric will have to be replaced by responsibility for all parties and politicians to be trusted. To ensure that it works will take time. It will mean more time spent in preparing, proposing and implementing policies which put people first. And it will mean deputies having less time working for individual constituencies and more working for all of the people. And that's virtually impossible to do with our current electoral system, and that's why I agree with what Frank is saying about that. Sooner or later, we have to act upon this. The centralisation of most of our decision-making also needs to change. We have the most centralised government system in the OECD. It has been changing over the past 20 years, but at a snail's pace. Most of the services we need on a day-to-day basis could and should be delivered by local government at a local level. Yes, there's a policy and regulatory role for national politicians and government departments, but we don't need to have it all centralised. Our civil service structures are arcane and outdated. The hierarchical structure that we have is based on the ranking structure of the British Army while it had an empire. It's well past its sell-by date. It leads to inefficiencies on a large scale and a system of deference among the grades that has no place in a modern society, because it leads to a serious underutilisation of the talents of many young people. Add to that fact that most sections of most departments and the departments themselves work in a silo system with the silo mentality, and that adds to the difficulties we face as a country. Now, I've always been an optimist. I still am. I believe that the current situation gives us an opportunity to fundamentally change our politics for the better and for the benefit of the people. I won't deny that my optimism has been somewhat dented since the government was formed, not least by internal rumblings in Fine Gael in a time of crisis post the Brexit results. That's old politics. There is also a danger of paralysis by analysis, lowest common denominator politics, where policies are decided not by ideas and ideologies, but by the next headline, and parties trying to ensure that they're not wrong-footed by opponents. Ministers deciding that they can ignore the advice of the Attorney-General and support legislation repugnant to the Constitution isn't new politics, as it was described by some commentators, but the very worst example of the bad examples of old politics. A lack of respect for the Constitution and for collective cabinet responsibility is the start of a very, very slippery slope. There are a number of other threats. One is a danger to all governments. We're often accused of it ourselves in government, whether the majority or minority. That is arrogance, saying all the right things in public but disrespecting opponents in private through media leaks and media manipulation is the most obvious way that would become apparent. A second threat is posed. You say you're committed to new politics and then feign hurt and shock and surprise when your opponents vote down a measure on which you didn't consult them. New politics means no surprises on any side. So there is a need for the lines of communication to be kept open at all times. Third, new politics will have to see a new level of maturity from the media, with some notable exceptions, I have to say. Largely among the political correspondents who are the real media experts in politics, it seems that some media simply cannot get their head around the fact that change is afoot, there is no going back, that politicians will have to work differently to respond to the needs of their electorate, and that the media will have to adjust too. Committees will be much more important in the future, and that should be reflected in the coverage given to them. Highlighting the positives of the work done by many of our hard-working public representatives might enhance our democratic system and people's belief in that. As I say, ladies and gentlemen, new politics will take time to bed down. It will take an effort. It will take openness from our political leaders to make it work. But I believe that it is worth the effort because it can restore faith in politics. Thank you very much.